Just sit down, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter.
Sit on the right.
For the people joining us on Zoom, we're going to start at 11 sharp. Now we're going to sign an MOU between the Gerhard Center and Natsen International. Shireen Travolsi-McCarthy will sign on behalf of Natsen. Associate Provost Adham Ramadan will sign for the AUC Gerhard Center. So without much ado, okay. Now we will start for around an hour and a half. It's a roundtable around a very interesting topic. Climate action, of course, COP27, everybody's talking about climate, and gender equality. So there are two interesting, I'd say in fashion probably, but the implication is very long term. And so when Shireen told me, let's have a roundtable around the topic, I said, of course, let's do it. The major challenge was most of the people are in COP27. The intention from the start was to only bring 20 people, 20, 30 people. We're not interested in the big crowds that everybody will talk 2-3 minutes and nothing happens. We're interested in real, deep discussion around the topic. Now, we're lucky to have many people who are in COP27 now who are joining us online. And we could think of this as a launch of the MOU. Hopefully we'll have many, many, many more opportunities to collaborate and maybe even to take this further. Maybe white paper, positioning paper, policy paper, whatever you call it. So without much ado, I'll pass to Shireen, and she will. She's the mastermind behind this, and she's also the moderator. So Shireen, the floor is yours, my dear.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay.
Welcome everyone. Everybody's joining us online and in the room. It's an extreme pleasure to be here. I'm so delighted to be back to the American University in Cairo, which was my intellectual home for so many years, and where I really learned a lot about the importance and the centrality of civil society organizations and mobilizing for change, not just within Egypt, but regionally and all over the world. So thank you so much for hosting us and organizing this roundtable discussion. Another reason why I'm absolutely delighted is because it's the Gerhardt Center. I used to work for the Gerhardt Center years ago, and also, you know, had an extreme pleasure of enjoying the friendships and the collaborations that emerged from working there. And that too was quite transformative in terms of my career, but also my intellectual advancement. When I left EUC, I moved on to USAID, and then from there went to the University of Oxford to do my DPhil in international development. And I don't think this would have been possible without the experiences and without the collaborations that I developed here. So again, a big thank you to all of you, to the American University in Cairo, to the Gerhardt Center for hosting us today. Now, before I start with the roundtable discussion, I want to give a quick introduction about who I am and what I do and what the National Center for Social Research does. So I'm Shamil Tarbolsi McCarthy, and I'm the director of NatCen International, which is the global social policy arm of a social research organization based in London and with branches in both Essex and Scotland. The National Center for Social Research is over 50 years old. We pride ourselves for our methodological rigor and for being very well known within the UK for the high quality of our research on social policy issues within the United Kingdom. About a year ago, as part of our diversification strategy and our 2030 goals, we decided, and along with our board of trustees, that we needed to establish an international arm, that there was a need to take that methodological expertise and social policy knowledge globally. And I was recruited and brought into the organization to help expand and advance that. And hence, NatCen International was born. I'm very proud of what we've achieved over the past year. We engage with a vast array of issues, global social policy issues, from health to education to issues related to climate change, migration, and we've got a work stream that focuses on global Britain, which is kind of the linchpin between our UK operations and our international ones, where we engage a little bit further into what is Britain's changing role in the world and how is it being impacted by broader geopolitical and economic changes globally. So that's who we are. We are a multidisciplinary team, and the reason why we are here today is because we want to focus on one of the areas that we're very keen to advance and take forward, which is climate change. And within that agenda, we have three areas of interest. The first one is we want to address data scarcity on climate variability in low and middle income countries. So here in this region, there's very limited data on climate variability, and also climate risks and the intersection between various socioeconomic factors and climate change. And we're very keen to strengthen data infrastructure and tap into existing expertise. And I've had the pleasure of seeing and meeting with a lot of experts from the American University in Cairo. We've got a lot to offer in that space. The other key agenda for us is to explore where the scope is for complementarity between international, multilateral organizations and indigenous or domestic actors at both the national and the subnational level. And again, working and engaging with Egypt, and Egyptian expertise is very much core to our work. And the last area is really supporting local agency and indigenous agency when it comes to climate action. So the focus of the discussion today is to look at gender and climate action in the MENA region, emphasizing the specificity of experiences and challenges, but also opportunities that have emerged from within this region. And I've just come from COP, and I know some of you have also come back from COP27. And it's been quite an enriching experience in terms of the level of leadership that Egypt and Egyptian experts have provided in putting front and center the necessity of thinking about reparations, thinking about loss and damage that's been done by wealthier countries, by northern countries towards the global south, and how to bring the conversation together, how to integrate the climate challenges that we're facing, along with other challenges related to peace building, for example, related to economic growth, and so on. And gender is very much at the heart of it, because we know very well, as the evidence shows us, that climate change does not affect all people in the same way, and that women are more adversely impacted by the effects of climate change than men, and they are impacted in different ways. And as a result of it, also gender dynamics change. So their coping strategies are different, their priorities are different, and hence the need to focus on this agenda at the meeting today. Now, I'm delighted to have quite an excellent panel of speakers, and I will let them kind of introduce themselves. So on my right-hand side is Dr. Huda Rashad. Would you please introduce yourself?
I'm Huda Rashad. I'm a director of the Social Research Center at the American University in Cairo. It's a sister department like Gerhard Center, I suppose, and very interested in issues of gender, trying to be interested in the issue of climate change and gender.
Thank you so much, Dr. Huda. And on my left-hand side is Amira. Would you want to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Shireen. I'm Amira Abdellatif. I'm the head of results-based management unit at the UNDP Egypt office. And results-based management is basically planning, monitoring, and evaluation. So it's a cross-cutting function among the different pillars in UNDP Egypt office. And I'm looking forward to our discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you. And Dina, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Dina Wafa. I'm Director of Executive Education at the School of Global Affairs, and I'm very happy to be here among everyone and all colleagues and friends. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dina. And joining us online are also some of our speakers. Jean Dikuna, would you please introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Jean Dikuna. I can't connect via the video for some reason. I'm UN Women's Senior Global Advisor on International Migration with an expanded portfolio also to look at decent work and entrepreneurship. And we've been looking at migration, not just in terms of labor migration, but also linking migration and displacement to climate change, DRR, and the like. And that's why my interest and my presence here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to have you. And again, please be patient with me because it can be a bit tricky to moderate a roundtable discussion in a hybrid manner. So apologies if there are any delays. I would also, because we are a small group, I think it also is worthwhile to go around the room and just have a quick round of introductions and then go ahead with the discussion. I will run it like a conversation more than a set of a set of rehearsed presentations. So shall we start off with the room here and then move to the screen? Munira.
Hello everyone, I'm Layla Al-Mushnib, Gender and Social Inclusion Advisor at USAID-funded Economic Governance Activity, and I have very strong affiliation to AUC, not only that I'm a former staff here, but also I'm a graduate from AUC, so I'm happy to be here, and thanks to Professor Ali for his kind invitation.
Hello, I'm Kariman Shuair. I run the research unit at the Gerhard Center.
Hi, Salma Mustafa. I work at the research center at the Gerhard Center, and I'm very interested in issues of development, critical development studies. I'm just excited for this conversation.
Excellent, thank you.
Good morning. My name is Adham Ramadan. I'm the Associate Provost for Research and the Dean of Graduate Studies at AUC. I also coordinate the AUC Climate Change Initiative.
Good morning, I'm Hind Ahmed. I recently joined the GAP Executive Education as an M&E officer in a Women Economic Empowerment project.
Pleasure to meet you. So now I'm going to head to the screen, and Mohammed, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yes, I'm Mohammed Abdrabbo. I'm head of Alexandria Research Center for Adaptation to Climate Change, Alexandria University. And our main focus when we talk about climate change is the economic and socioeconomic aspects of climate change. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Munira, could you please introduce yourself?
Good morning. I'm Munira Suleiman. I'm a professor of comparative literature at Cairo University, and I'm also on the board of trustees of the Women in Memory Forum in Egypt. I'm very happy to be joining you today. Thank you.
Thank you. Ercelia, would you please introduce yourself? I think you're muted, so yeah. Ercelia, we can hear you now. I think we should be able to hear you, but we can't. Okay. Okay, I'll go to the next participant and then come back to you because we want to be introduced. I mean, Ercelia Francesca is a professor at the University of Naples, L'Orientale. And it would be great. She's also a gender expert. It would be great to really hear from her. And yeah, you can hear it. We can't hear you, Ercelia, unfortunately, but hopefully we'll sort that out. And then, Trupti, over to you. Could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, Trupti is not able to join. Can I join on her behalf?
Sorry?
Yeah, Trupti is due to some technical issues, she could not join. So I am another director of the company. So can I?
Oh, that's fine. Yeah.
Permission?
Please, yes, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Paul. I'm joining from India. We are a social enterprise. We are working with the vulnerable, poor women farmers across India, Africa, and Southeast Asia. And we are the winner of the Climate Change Action Award from United Nations.
Excellent, brilliant. Okay, so as I said, I'm going to run this more as a conversation so that we can kind of put our brains together and try to figure out how gender and climate action intersect within the MENA region, kind of dig a bit more deeply into experiences from different parts of the region. So let me start off by saying that despite the scarcity of analysis and the scarcity of data on climate variability in the region, we know that there are some serious challenges, right? There was this recent report that was developed by the Met Office and FCDO in the UK about climate variability and socioeconomic factors in the MENA region. And they identified a set of key challenges. One of the main challenges, one of the main climate risks are related to food insecurity in the region, because with rising temperatures and with extreme heat, crop failure and harvest failures become a lot more prominent and a lot more likely to happen. And with regions already, like Yemen, for example, already suffering from food insecurity, climate change is only going to exacerbate already existing vulnerabilities within those countries. The other challenge that was also pointed out, and which we are all familiar with, is water scarcity. You know, Egypt is already experiencing those issues, and there are concerns about the long-term trajectory of water scarcity within this country. Yemen is also another country where we've seen water becoming a resource that feeds directly into a political conflict, and where the political conflict has also led and contributed to and exacerbated the mismanagement of water resources. So water scarcity, food insecurity, rising sea levels, that's another issue. And I was in the discussions that I've participated in and engaged with at the COP, worries about Alexandria, for example, and rising sea levels and the capacity to cope with potential changes that may take place were very much front and center in those debates. And there are other concerns also with desertification and land degradation across across the region. But what that means is also that gender becomes a very important component here, because women, again, as I mentioned earlier, react differently to those challenges and cope with them in different ways. And they can be more vulnerable to those challenges. We know that the majority of the world's poor are women, right? More than men. And so the socioeconomic challenges, the multidimensional vulnerabilities that women experience can be quite serious within the region. So I'll turn to Jean first, and I'll ask you about, in your experience and based on your background, how have women in the MENA region engaged with the effects of climate change, and especially where the effects of climate change have intersected with displacement or migration? And if you could also walk us through what UN Women has done in that space.
Thanks so much, Shireen, and thanks for having us as part of this conversation. Well, to begin with, women constitute about 60% of the climate-sensitive agricultural workforce in the Arab region. In their traditional roles as nurturers, as small-scale, less emissions-intensive subsistence farmers, as small-scale livestock rearers, as producers and as managers of food, as water, managers of natural resources, as consumers of less emission-intensive goods and services, women contribute less to greenhouse gas emissions than men. But as we all know, they are also located at the lower ends of value chains, agricultural and other value chains, and this diminishes their resilience to climate variations relative to men. A few examples. In Yemen, for instance, where women do 60% of the farm labor, 90% of livestock rearing, 1% of wage labor, but own only 1%, 10% of wage labor, but own only 1% of the land, and earn about 50% less than men for comparable work, the tropical storm of 2008 that hit Yemen really wiped out and eroded women's even more meager assets than men and their food stocks. And in the poverty rates that spiked by about 40% in the hardest hit governorates, women were more starkly impacted. Women are also marginalized from access to early warning information, particularly older women, women with disabilities, where the formats and the means of dissemination are totally unsuited to their needs. They are marginalized from evacuation planning, support arrangements to move, and so on. Workloads increase for women in times of crisis. There is extreme food insecurity, negative food coping, widespread violence, lack of access to healthcare, lack of access to relief and reconstruction items, and marginalization from decision-making. So these are some of the disproportionate impacts that women face. Now, the World Bank suggests that climate conditions are really responsible for about 10 to 20% of the current migration flows in the region, including rural to urban migration, and this is projected to increase. The type of hazard and socio-cultural political contexts pretty much mediate migration trajectories in terms of whether it's internal or external, or the length of time, or whether women move autonomously, or whether they move with families, or they stay behind. Now, in the drought of Syria, you saw entire villages, men and women, moving across to urban sites, including the outskirts of Damascus, but we also saw women moving independently to Western cities as vegetable packers, or you saw men moving to Lebanon and Jordan as construction workers, as agricultural workers. In each of these host sites, resources were extremely strained, and women were marginalized from access to socio-economic, cultural resources of every kind. In the Arab region, women tend to stay behind while men migrate. And they uphold then the household and the rural economy with workload increases, with stress increases. And they are in very precarious situations if remittances are not forthcoming from men or are not forthcoming regularly from men. But I don't want to project women just as victims, because they also bring, and they bring this spectacularly, their local knowledge, their skills, their expertise, their networks, their leadership attributes to bear on frontline response and on longer term recovery and development. And for example, in the arid, the semi-arid mountains of Zamor in Tunis, women were engaged in projects related to vegetation planting, planting local species of fruits. And this not only enhanced food availability, but it also contributed to less greenhouse gas emissions, to climate mitigation. It prevented soil erosion, landslides. It contributed to building or maintaining the biodiversity of that mountainous ecosystem. They were also engaged in collecting rainwater, water conservation, through stone water pocket planting, through building small dams on slopes, and this reduced water stress. So what does UN Women do on the issue? Well, we adopt an intersectional approach to gender equality and women's rights, and we adopt a nexus approach that addresses climate change, extreme weather events, disasters, migration, displacement in a harmonized way, as linked agendas, not treating them in silos. And this is reflected both in our normative work and in our operational work. So normative, we're really engaged in providing support to standard setting, regional as well as cross-regional. For instance, we worked very closely with UNDRR at the Arab-African Ministerial Dialogue on DRR, and these agendas were incorporated into the outcome document. Operationally, we are engaged in research on the links between climate change, disasters, migration, displacement from a gender perspective in the Arab region, focusing not just on different categories of women, but also other excluded groups. And we are also concluding a research on climate change, gender, and migration, focusing here on different categories of women in Jordan and Sudan. We're doing a review of policies, climate and DRR policies, from this intersectional and nexus approach, and building tools to help governments and others design and implement policies and programs from an intersectional gender approach and a nexus approach. We have across Africa about over 20 initiatives, I think, supporting about 40,000 women on building climate resilience in agriculture, women's climate resilience. In Morocco, we've mainstreamed gender into the policies, programs, budgets of the water sector, and also supported gender focal points, government focal points participating in COP conferences. And lastly, I do want to say that 2 days ago, we actually launched with LAS a women's economic empowerment program for the MENA region. This is a regional program which actually focuses on green jobs, and climate sensitive agriculture is one of those pillars. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jean. I think you've made it very clear how women are being more adversely affected by the effects of climate change, but that they also hold part of the solution, right? And that with the right systems in place and the right investment, they could potentially turn things around in terms of climate adaptation, mitigation strategies, but also the long-term shifts that we need to have in place in terms of policies. So that takes me to, and you mentioned also that nexus intersectional approach, which is really, really important. I think one of the comments that were brought up a number of times at COP27 this year is the fact that it felt that the agendas were quite fragmented, right? So there's the gender agenda, where you go and you just talk about, gender-related issues and climate change, and then there's the climate finance agenda, and then there's the adaptation agenda, and there's the mitigation agenda. But then there was always that idea at the back of our heads, how do you integrate all of these agendas together into a more holistic approach? Because that is the only way that you can start thinking about policy. So how can climate finance become more gender responsive, right? How can any form of engagement in terms of understanding climate mitigation, adaptation strategies become a lot more gender responsive and understanding the gender dynamics that are at the heart of it? And so it's great that UN Women seems to be, pushing this agenda forward across the Arab region and building some of the evidence base that's required to do that. But that takes me to a question. When you mentioned nexus, the first thing that came up in my head was the development, humanitarian, peace and security nexus. So I'm interested in digging a little bit more deeply into the development dimension to it. And my question is to Amira here, that development approach is really at the heart of this discussion, that you cannot have a climate strategy without taking into account the broader socioeconomic factors that climate change has intersected with. And I gave that example of Alexandria, people who are living by the sea coast and how they'd be impacted by rising sea levels. You can't just show up and ask them, well, you know, you have to move, you have to go somewhere else. You need to put in place the instruments and the long-term strategies possible for them to be able to survive. So we know we need better infrastructure, we need better financing instruments and better capacities. What has UNDP done in that space? And if you can just reflect on that, please.
Thank you, Shireen. UNDP has supported the MENA region on climate change issues for several years on adaptation and mitigation, and especially in Egypt. In Egypt, we are partnering with the Ministry of Environment, and our main financial partners are GEF and GCF. These are like the green global funds. So when it comes to mitigation in Egypt, UNDP is very proud that we have made some behavioral change when it comes to the use of LED lights. We have introduced the LED lights some time ago, and we piloted this project with the Ministry of International Cooperation. The whole building was lit with the LED lights. And we are proud that we made this change in the culture of Egyptian people to use the LED bulbs that are more that save more energy. We also have helped a lot of hotels and banks to install solar panels to use green energy. We help them technically and financially. And we also supported the green transport. We have created the buses, the green buses. And we have made a very specific project for girls in Fayoum, which is bike sharing, because there was on a needs-based assessment, we understood that girls were not able to access the university in Fayoum because they were unable to use the public transport. So we have made this bike sharing project for them. On the adaptation, as you were talking about Alexandria, we helped the coastal areas building, like sand buffers to avoid the flooding when there is sea rise. We also work in a lot of biodiversity, protected areas to preserve the biodiversity, and specifically to create jobs for women living in these communities, like making handcrafts, and we help them advertise for their products and sell it to tourists and visitors who come to the protected areas. And also we made some guidelines on how to preserve the biodiversity in these areas. So moving from the climate change to the relation between climate change and gender, definitely climate change impact is not gender neutral. As Jean and yourself have highlighted, they impact men and women differently. Yes, women are less educated and maybe poorer, and they have less access to land, to finances, to technologies. And also, as Jean highlighted, they also have a set of skills that are different and need to be chipped in when we are developing a climate change policy. So their voices have to be heard when it comes to developing policies and implementation of climate change action. So UNDP has developed a gender analysis. This is a global thing, gender analysis under the nationally determined contributions. And this gender analysis is to help understand the gender different impacts of climate change and identify the key actors and capacities in a country. They assess the policies and strategies, which ones are supportive and inclusive to gender transformation change. They also help gender mainstreaming in the policies and capacities, especially in the areas where traditionally gender was not mainstreamed, like the waste management, the climate, the green energy. We have also, or UNDP has also globally developed a COVID-19 gender responsive tracker. And this is to measure two things. First of all, the participation of women in the COVID-19 response task forces in the countries. And to see which policies also take into account the women's social and economic security, and to measure violence against women, because there was a recent study that unfortunately during crisis the violence against women increased. So this tracker was developed and implemented in about 230 countries, including Egypt. And I think UN Women also were partners with us in developing this tool. And very recently, during COP, we also launched the 10-point action agenda for advancing gender equality in crisis settings. And this is like a road map to guide the programs to advance gender equality in crisis context. And this is in line with our gender equality strategy that we just launched for 2022-2025. This is to advance the women's leadership and participation in a crisis context. I'll stop here, thank you.
Excellent, but I've got quite a follow-up question to that, because I think you mentioned behavioral change, and behavioral change is difficult and it takes time. So can you reflect on some of the challenges maybe that you've faced, and where do you see that headed? And again, an example from the COP is that when we were there, you saw these green buses, you know, and there was a question by a lot of the visitors whether or not this is always like that, or is it just because of the COP27? How do we retain, you know, that energy and agency that we've witnessed post-COP, so that it's not just about those 2 weeks and it goes beyond that?
Yes, thank you, Shireen. I will start with the COP27 because I also want to highlight how we supported Sharm el-Sheikh to prepare itself for the COP27. We have also installed some solar panels in like the main government buildings at the airport and the main hospital, and we have helped Sharm el-Sheikh to be green or plastic-free, and plastic-free just before COP. I cannot say they are 100% plastic-free, but we push so hard to reach this target. And the buses, this is not just for COP. We have worked with Sharm el-Sheikh so hard throughout the year and before that to ensure the sustainability of these projects. Yeah, these projects are not for the COP, they will be sustained later. For the behavioral change, yes, you're right, it's very hard to measure, and that's why we need to have a lot of impact evaluations, and you know, it's not a direct relationship. You cannot say that after so many years, this change is because of your intervention. So it's not like a direct thing, but you can say that you contributed to that behavioral change. And of course, it needs a lot of follow-up and longer times. We saw this change long before our project was closed. So, but we believe that the impact was because of this initiative that we introduced.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Amira. You've alleviated that concern. I mean, I'm hoping, and everybody there was hoping, that there's a sustained impact for Egypt out of the COP. And if anything, that would be quite a strong output of the conference. So moving to Dina, and also related issue here is that, so we've been talking about, Amira has been talking about also the socioeconomic aspect, and that, you know, there's a need for a holistic approach to engaging with the gender dynamics of climate action. And if you can give me a sense, you've worked on socioeconomic empowerment of women. Can you give me a sense of where you see that intersecting with climate action? How and what are the pathways? How do you get Egyptian women, for example, on board of that climate agenda?
Thank you, Shireen. Well, with regarding to climate change, as we talk about Egypt, and it's one of the countries most affected by the climate change. However, COP27 in itself is an indication of the acceleration of national efforts and policies to try to protect the environment. Of course, Egypt has ratified several conventions with regards to that. Regarding the impact of climate change on women, and particularly their health, food security, and decent living standards, there have been some serious measures taken in Egypt, like, for instance, the Decent Life Initiative, raising awareness on rural initiatives in eco-friendly agriculture. They've established the National Council for Climate Change, and if anything, the Ministry of Environment is headed by a female minister as well. However, and one of the, it's worth mentioning that one of the main themes of the COP27 is dedicated entirely to women. This shows a clear understanding of the importance or the impact of climate change significantly on women, especially women and girls, because they wear the brunt of any environmental and economic and social shocks. So worldwide, women's have inequalities in their representation in the labor force. This is a worldwide thing that we see. There's globally, women constitute about 40% of the workforce, more likely to be unemployed than their men counterparts. They're more prone to be working in the informal sector, which is unprotected, and then tend to be paid less than men, with a global gender wage gap of around 23%. And women tend to spend 2.5 times more on unpaid household tasks, such in taking care of childcare or elderly care and housework, which is around, if it was monetized, it would be from 10 to 39% of GDP. Over and above, we also have people with disabilities who are also disadvantaged, because I'm getting there because our project has worked both with women and with women with disabilities. So we focus on two very vulnerable groups. When we talk about people with disabilities, there's also a strong correlation between disability and poverty. People with disabilities are found to be the poorest of the poor. 80% of them are living in lower and middle income countries, and support is not abundant. So in Egypt, women bear the primary responsibility for any domestic and child, elderly, or if they have a child with disability or a person with disability in the house, they are the ones mainly responsible for care duties within the household. And this consumes most of their time. And limits their availability to education and employment. So while Egypt has shown steady improvements in education for women, and there is parity, more or less, yet when it comes to employment, the outcomes for women are not as comparable. So these discrepancies are evident, although there are several legislations that do promote or aid women in working, such as ensuring equal pay for work, prohibiting wage gaps in law number 12. Also Article 35 that prohibits discrimination on the basis of gender and so on. And other regulations that allow for maternity leave, childcare, and all of that. But however, nevertheless, even with all of these laws in place, there still needs more of raising awareness and more forceful actions toward ensuring that women are actually achieve parity in the labor market as well. Now, with the program that we have been delivering with, in cooperation with the UN Women, Jean, this is the Training for Employment project. Its objective is developing a strengthened cadre of qualified young Egyptian women to enter or re-enter the job market. We focused on both young women who graduated from public universities and women who want to re-enter the job market, and actually those were the ones that were needed a lot of support. They had worked for some time and then stayed home for care duties, and wanted to re-enter the job market. One of the things we used to find very common among most of the participants was their lack of self-confidence. this was one of the things that many women, and a lot of research shows that this is one of the things that always hinders women from going back to work, for applying for jobs, for speaking up if they're unequal pay and so on. The capacity building we delivered was mainly on market demand through employers, asking employers and an assessment of employers and their needs. It was skills-based, and we also provided a lot of career guidance and career coaching. Again, women needed more reassurance, more on confidence building, more on communication, as this was one of the main hindrances, in addition, of course, to how they expressed that they found difficulty competing with the men counterparts. Of course, women with disabilities, where it was more difficult. Cultural hindrances, such as parents or a husband not allowing them to go out to work, or not allowing them to do certain jobs, or to stay late at work. All of these are cultural hindrances that face women, and raising awareness on these issues is very important so that we do achieve parity in the job market for women.
Excellent, thank you so much, Dina. I think you've given us a really thorough overview of the needs and some of the challenges for socioeconomic empowerment of women in Egypt. But I think that takes me to kind of the next question, which is about how can climate action become a lot more gender responsive? When we think about all of these initiatives that are being put forward now because of COP27 and across the country, there is also a need to think about, what is the space for gender to be present within those initiatives. And I'm keen to understand, what are the challenges? You've already pointed out a number of challenges already, Dina, but also where the opportunities lie. And I think I'm going to go to Jean again. Jean, from where you sit in UN Women, what are your thoughts on the barriers to gender responsiveness and climate action in the region? And are you able to reflect on differences between, from one country to another?
Yeah, so in terms of barriers, I think there is a need for vision that looks at holistic sustainable development, number one. There also seems, in terms of a barrier, to be a pervasiveness of discriminatory social norms, not just on gender, but gender in interaction with other social forms of marginalization and inequalities like age, race, ethnicity, migration status, and the like. A pervasiveness of vested interests, governance deficits, a lack of accountability, and this blunts political will. Now, even if there is political will, then there's a lack of conceptual clarity on the intersectional approach to gender equality and women's rights, and on a nexus approach to addressing these issues across policy fields. There is a lack of capacity to apply these principles, that is intersectional gender equality and a nexus approach, to address the priorities of different groups of women when designing, implementing, monitoring, evaluating policies, programs, and budgets that address different groups of women. And this lack of will and this lack of capacity also takes the form then of very fractured climate finance. It's a few multilateral agencies or mechanisms that have gender benchmarks. There's very little finance going to climate-sensitive gender infrastructure, or, for instance, renewable energy, where, targeted at women. Very little money. In 2014, only 2% went to local women on the ground in countries of the global south. So these are some of the huge barriers. But I do see opportunities. Number one, the whole framework, international human rights framework, Paris Declaration, Sendai, CEDAW, SDGs, etc., But we need to galvanize the momentum of the COPs. We have 2 COPs in our region, Egypt and then now UAE next year. Egypt is focusing on damage and loss, implementation, flagship initiatives, including a huge flagship initiative with governments in Africa on gender equality and women's rights, in which UN Women is a global partner. We have the Lima Plan of Action on gender equality and women's rights. And these are opportunities or entry points that we must harness to do what? Framed within a sustainable development paradigm and drawing on a whole of government, whole of society approach, and placing climate affected women, different groups of women at the heart of decision making, we need to generate data and analysis disaggregated by sex, but also and gender, but also in interaction with other forms of marginalization or other variables, number one. We need, and this should be on the priorities of different categories of women, we need to build the capacities of government, civil society to mainstream the priorities of these different groups of women, and this data needs to be used to inform them, build their capacity to design and implement, monitor and evaluate climate, DRR, migration and displacement policies, strategies, programs, and budgets that are backed by strong indicators, targets, etc. So we see real change on the ground. We need to build women's leadership to be part of these decision-making mechanisms. And we do need to invest sustainable finance on community-led projects by women at scale that address the different priorities of women across these linked agendas.
Thank you so much, Jean. I think you've pointed out a lot of key issues there. Dr. Ali, do you want to go next?
Okay. I have a comment. I mean, always when you talk about gender equality, you try to get empowerment for women. I mean, the other parallel is changing the culture, and that takes 20, 30 years. But in the meantime, you focus on empowerment, which entails either education, access to good jobs, or enablement to start their own jobs. Now, a very interesting model that I've seen is what the Paul is doing in India. They have an innovation called Buhungro, which means in Gujarati straw, which is basically a technical device to store water in rainy season under the ground, so you could use it during the dry season. Now, as such, it's just a pure frugal technical innovation. The interesting part about it is the women climate leadership model around it. What they do is that they give the right of this water stored underwater to women. Now imagine, you're talking about a very dry area, water is a paramount, and it's actually getting more scarce because of the climate change. And all of a sudden, in a very paternal, very male-dominated area, you give the right to the water to women. That's absolute empowerment. I mean, you cannot go beyond that. And I think we need more of those kind of things. It's go beyond, well, there is lots of women empowerment, we need the women empowerment, there are lots of inequality and whatever. Yes, we agree. This is happening. But we need to go beyond that to really give women a power on things that are vital. And I'm not talking about women who are educated, so they tend to be on board of banks, or educated. I'm talking about base of the pyramid, which is really 70, 80% of the population. And you can probably hear more from Paul if you want to get more in this, but this for me is really a fantastic way to do women empowerment. Thank you.
I think that is a great example, and it ties with what Jean was talking about in terms of the need for a holistic approach to sustainable development that has that gender responsiveness at its core. I think the example that you provided is actually not unusual in the region. Tunisia, they do exactly the same thing in terms of storing water and so on, but the rights are not necessarily given to women, right? It is a cultural practice. And there's a broader discussion to be had maybe around whether or not the green agenda or climate agenda is also going to be gender transformative, is also going to be an opportunity for not just for women to become more socioeconomically empowered, but also that it would have a trickle effect into their lives more generally and become genuine empowerment in all aspects of life, within the household, within their families, and so on. But I would like to move to Dr. Huda and get her input and kind of reflections on everything that was mentioned so far. So we've covered now some of the barriers and the opportunities and the initiatives that have emerged from UNDP, UN Women, what EUC's been working on. We talked about that, and I go back to what Jean was saying, that the need for a more holistic approach of vision. What are your thoughts on that, especially from your work on health and social policy in Egypt and the Arab region?
That's not easy, the reflection, but very interesting and quite informative presentation, actually. My first general reaction is that the rationale for a discussion on climate and gender is that women are disproportionately affected, their coping mechanisms are weaker, if you want action, it has to be gender sensitive, and so on. This is, to my mind, is not specific enough, because if you talk about any crisis, wars, if you talk about epidemics, whatever you're going to talk about, I can invoke the same rationale. And the solution to that in general, like Dr. Ali maybe said when we talked about empowerment, you either work on the gender dynamics, work more on gender dynamic, you work a little on social disadvantage and so on, and you make sure that when you do an action, it's not gender blind, it's inclusive of women, okay? So what I generally feel is that we need to be much more specific to the issues of climate challenges and how do they translate into the differentiated impact, their pathways of change. And the reason for that is not just scientific, it's simply to allow you to engage with action. Where do you intervene, at what level do you intervene, so as to make a case for it. Of course, Jean, for example, when she talked, I was very happy because she started her work with very specific examples of how the climate interact with disadvantage and so on. So maybe my first kind of general comment, we need more of that. We need a methodological rigor to convince me of the differentiated impact at that level of differentiated impact. I'm sure you're all aware that there are studies that shows in certain contexts, men are affected more. There are, I mean, it's not across the board. It depends on the context and depends on livelihood, and there are different varieties of exposure and different kind of localized nature of that. So that's one aspect of it, which is very specific on the climate and on gender. The other kind of remark, which in a way seems to be the opposite, and this is what Jean was getting at, which was about the vision in general, the development approach in general, and how the whole idea of inequalities, discrimination, the intersection between disadvantage and ethnic composition of gender and so on. This is a principle. And when Amira, you were talking about the gender sensitive tool, I was telling to myself, I call it different. I mean, I do the same tool, but I call it equity analysis. And basically the equity analysis is when there is any policy, there are three elements of it. Does it provide equal opportunities to everybody? Do I measure the differentiated impact on different social groups? Do I adopt what is called positive discrimination or disproportionate universalism and so on? So this is a kind of reaction. We need more of the methodological rigor. We need more proof. We need more evidence to make a case. Otherwise, it's going to be very, very general. And by the way, I'm not objecting to the rationale that you need to work on gender. You need to work on socioeconomic development. You need not to be gender blind. Fine, do that. And it's in every case. But that's not enough if you want to get to the climate and gender. The second point, and I think it was raised by Jean and by Ali as well. I'm sorry about the first name basis. I hope you don't mind. The second is the idea of women as actors, which is extremely important. A couple of days ago, I was watching the COP27, and they brought in an expert in climate change. How can they act? I was a bit surprised by his answer, because his answer was, you can advocate better, you can make your voices heard, you can join forces together, which is fine. You pressure, but you pressure someone else. You're not acting. And I was very interested to hear more about, can we do something else by that? The development discourse in general nowadays, we have been for a long period talking about agency, individual factors, community change. We have talked about that and over-focused on that. The development discourse, and in public health as well, the development discourse is now talking about two principles, and Jean really talked about it very clearly. The first is the whole idea of upstream forces. Yani enough of blaming, in a way, the victim. Let's go back to the governance issues, to the public policies, to the responsibility of those upstream forces. So you talk about big kind of policies and so on. And then the other issue, which is in the heart of gender, is the equity. The issue of, are you treating different social groups the same way? Gender in the core of it, of course, because gender is not just social group, it's an intersection of disadvantage, of culture, of social, of biological. So that's how the discourse is happening. When I look at the gender discourse, what I found is slightly different. In the the climate discourse. When I look at the climate discourse, I see the focus on government action. I see the focus on macro policies. And it makes sense. But what comes to my mind, what is the weight of the individual and the community in that? I'm not sure I know the answer, and maybe you are more expert in the climate change, because I did hear a lot about the issue of it doesn't really make that big of a difference. Someone was talking, and this is not an expert talking, but they were talking about the recycling of water bottles, and they were saying we were telling people, do recycling, do whatever, and someone came up and said, what is the percentage of that in terms of being able to do it and that. So my question here, before we tilt the balance again to the community and behavioral change, how much that change is effective in terms of breaking the cycle of climate change? It may be, I don't know. I'm just posing it to just to do the balance. Yeah. The idea is you talked about rigorous methodological issues. This is the rigorous methodological issues that you can contribute. I don't want to talk a lot. There's a lot of public health, but I don't want to, maybe I stop here, and if I get a chance to talk specifically what's happening in my area of health. I'll just say one issue in terms of the health. I'm work in a center where we talk a lot about public health and issues of health and so on, and issues of public policies and the relation to health. And all of a sudden, it just dawned on me, we don't work at all on climate change. We don't as a center. It's not a thematic focus. We don't link the climate with the health. We link other things, even commercial, international commercial relation, and it's very important to health. And we are proposing a new project on healthy aging, and we decided to go with the flow and to sort of say part of it will be a conceptual development on the linkage of climate change and the health, the healthy aging, the health of the seniors. I do not know yet what I'm going to do there because it requires conceptualization, it requires thinking, and that's the kind of issues. I'm not saying it, in your intervention, you covered it. I mean, I'm not really reflecting to your intervention. I'm reflecting to the state of the art, of that kind of need, and that kind of intervention requires strengthening, so as to be able to talk scientifically, give statements. I read the statement, and I'll stop here, but I read the statement, it was in UN publication, and they were saying something, it was in the UN Gender Sensitive Action, the 2015. And they were saying something, 50% improvement in food security came from women empowerment interventions. And I looked at this and I said, why? Wow, where is the food? I haven't read the literature, but what came to my mind, what do they mean by 50% food insecurity? What is this? And what have they done to women so that they contributed 50%? This is the statement that I wish it has a stronger evidence base, so as we are able to really engage. Because there are other priorities in the world, even with the COP27, there are other priorities that governments will turn their eye to. Thank you.
I think that those are excellent remarks, and I'm keen to kind of open the floor for discussion because I see a lot of questions and hands raised. But I just want to say something that I think the reason why there's a focus on that macro level and governments in particular, although I don't think the solution will come directly from governments, you need a regulatory environment to push towards the net zero targets, is because of scale. If you start off only with individual change and behavioral change, the kind of effect that we're looking to achieve by 2030 or 2040, yesterday I was at a reception for our World 2050, our 2050 world, so we're always kind of moving our targets and our deadlines. But in order to really reach those targets, it's not going to happen just from the ground up. The bottom of the pyramid does not have enough agency to make that happen. It will have to come. That is my kind of perspective. It will have to come from a regulatory environment that pushes for it to happen, and from the private sector and multilaterals, MDBs and finance institutions coming in and putting forward the money and taking on board some of the risks that will be associated with having those policies in place, right? But I don't think it's very difficult for it to be just from the ground up. And related fact to it is, I was in a discussion with somebody from Nigeria, and he was telling me, you know what, they keep on telling us, stop using coal, move from coal into solar energy or whatever. But he's like, there are neighborhoods in this country that don't have access to energy at all, right? So let us even use coal first and have some form of energy supply, and then ask us to move into a safer, cleaner energy. Now, of course, you can leapfrog and avoid going through that process altogether. But again, there's a need to look at the broader kind of power dynamics that are at play between northern and southern countries in that space. And the next part, I want to look at that complementarity, that question of how do you bring the macro and the micro together? How do you bring the multilateral, the national and the subnational together, which is very much at the heart of looking again at gender and equity and inclusivity within the climate agenda. But I want to open the floor because I see a lot of hands and questions, and over to you first, and then.
Yeah, so basically, I agree with you, Shireen, of what you just summarized. To really, the major contributors to emissions now are the energy and transportation sectors. And these are two sectors where individually the individual change of modalities are not going to be that impactful. It does require that much wider or much higher level of regulatory framework and engagement worldwide. So yes, so that's why I guess what you talked about, the commentator being asking individuals to be play more advocacy. Basically, it's individuals other than doing their own thing, which was not going to really impact either energy consumption or transportation emissions, but pressurize those decision makers, international organizations to really do step up and put more of a framework that allows that. What is interesting in what Dr. Hoda mentioned is, what I find interesting, again, I'm not a gender, I don't, not even expert, but not even, is the issue of women, when I think in Egypt, related, women's, or the impact of food security on women, and especially health, it's something that maybe people don't look at very much. Yeah. And the issue is that individually, women are, it's the adaptation measures that need to be focused on, because none of us are going to necessarily conduct actions that will have a significant impact on emissions. It's the smaller communities, the farming communities, where gender sensitivity or gender impact is greatest, are the ones that will need to have action or focus on. So my question, general question, is that, and related to what the example Ali mentioned, what are on the ground actions that can take place to actually improve the resilience of communities and women within those communities to climate change impact?
Okay. Shall we take just a round of reactions and questions and then go back to our speakers? Is that okay? Okay, so you had the question, right? You can go around that way. Yeah, I'll give it to you.
Okay. I think, yes, building on this recent discussion, I was also thinking about how the greatest responsibility for climate change comes from the people most affected by it. So it's mostly farming communities who must change their whole lifestyles. And when we think about things that maybe are understudied, so affluent industries like real estate, like construction, so these are things that maybe we could apply gender lens to, which I haven't considered before, but perhaps if we consider investment practices across the gender spectrum, so more men invest in real estate, and what does that do for like social spaces of capital that happen afterwards? And also how I think that no matter how much small agricultural communities adapt, as long as in the city or in urbanity we are behaving the way that we do, we will not catch up to that. So we will not break even with this interaction. Yeah, so that's my concern. And I think that the development perspective always puts at the forefront that we will not rise outside of, or we will not improve or advance outside of economic development or socioeconomic development. So we have these standardized approaches to communities where we need to support women in order to have their own businesses, in order to improve their craft. However, we are not considering like if we look holistically, how does that help women really combat gender? How does combat climate change or adapt to climate change? And why are we asking women to adapt to climate change, knowing that they are going to inevitably be affected by it a lot more than people who are in wealthier contexts, in wealthier, areas? And yeah, so I think my call or my thought is that maybe we could be doing more research into things that are not studied, but think of it more holistically. So investment practices, how, yeah, things that are just affluent businesses, affluent industries, and how these can be really brought into the development perspective. So why development only focuses on the people who have less agency. We do not focus on the people who do have agency to do things the way they want to. Well, that's not what we're like. Why are we looking at people who, cannot say no to certain things? But we are not looking at people who are saying no, who are refusing to behave a certain way. So what is the development response to that? That's my concern.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Laila, over to you. Sorry.
I'm more interested to just a couple of comments or reflections on the way ahead, especially if we're talking about the MENA region. So, colleagues have skillfully developed the connection between climate change and gender equality. And I think maybe another premise that we need to acknowledge is that both climate change and gender equality are issues that are very relevant to all countries in the MENA region, irrespective of their income level. So saying that, is collaboration possible? I think collaboration possible, and we have to trigger collaboration into this direction among the different MENA countries. During the COP27, and maybe even in preparation to the COP27, we found collaborations on green hydrogen, on renewable energy between countries like the UAE and Egypt, the Middle East green initiatives, and so on. And here, let me give an example of what can be done. Masdar, which is a UAE developer of renewable energy and implementer of different projects, they have signed a lot of agreements to deliver a number of projects in Egypt on solar energy, on green hydrogen. Masdar, they have a very interesting platform, one of their strategic platforms. It's called WISER. WISER, it is wiser, yes, but it stands for Women in Sustainability, WISER, Environment and Renewable Energy. This platform is very active. They have their annual forum. They try to advance for more and increased engagement of women in renewable energy and in the environment. They have their white papers, but not only are they active in creating a debate and a discussion and research, but they are also active in training the women in STEM, training and offering mentorship programs for women. So I think these types of collaboration, if Masdar is coming to Egypt, for example, let's also not export only the know-how, but let's export the culture of promoting women in this sector. Another thing, maybe we, throughout different colleagues, we mentioned the number of stakeholders. We talked about government either as a regulator, policymaker, private sector, we have the civil society, we have the international donor community. So I think another important key is that all stakeholders align their efforts. We have different strategies, even on government level or on donor agency level, strategies that either handle or tackle gender equality or tackle climate change. We rarely do the alignment between both. Even if we have gender or climate change in national strategies of the different Arab countries, still they are dealt with in silos. They are not connected. The connection is not clear, is invisible, unfortunately, till the present day. I think also something very important that we consider as the MENA region is going to, by 2050, to a net zero carbon, is that, okay, net zero carbon means, what does it mean for companies? It means for companies that some goods and some services will become obsolete, or maybe the demand on these goods will not be as before. So what does that mean? That means that yes, there's an opportunity for technological advances, for innovation, but at the same time there is a risk that livelihoods of men and women working in these areas will be challenged. If we do not work on training women on greener jobs, training women farmers on how to apply organic farming techniques, I think we are losing a lot and we are creating a catastrophe. We are not solving or maybe solving the environment issue, but messing up with the livelihoods of many women and girls. So I think also something like that, and this would bring together the private sector and the business community with the government, because I think such reskilling needs to be like more comes from a holistic approach and not like individual companies and so on. Another issue is the leadership and increasing the representation of women, and I think colleagues have covered that quite well. But let me say something. If we want to promote for women leadership, it is very important that women sit on the negotiation tables. It's not enough that women are backstage, which we often see, and we have been seeing in COP27 women preparing, drafting talking points, women like policy notes, but they are not there on the table negotiating. I think this is something that we have to keep in mind. And again, looking at the private sector, there has been like a huge hype about having more women on boards. And yes, it has proved that yes, having more women on boards, women like tend to address more environmental issues, push more for ESG reporting and so on. But let us look at the pipeline. Where are women leaders in the pipeline? What actually and practically happened is that companies, they like bring outsider women, they put them on the board, and they take the box, we have women on the board. Type, what about building the pipeline of women leaders who can really create change within the company? I think this is also very important. I think this is more or less covers what my reflections are from the session today.
Thank you so much. That was very, very comprehensive. Now, unfortunately, I can't see those on the screen who've been joining us. So oh, sorry, there's a question over here. Okay, can we just go to the screen and come back to you, okay? Because I couldn't see them. So, Mohammed, would you please just go ahead?
Yeah, thank you, Shireen. I have to say that I'm not a gender specialist. My work is focusing on environmental economics and climate economics. I have a couple of points that I would like to raise. The first is the discussion, usually discussion about women empowerment and so on, will usually focusing on how to help women to have a role in society, in development, and so on. I think we need to have a sort of a parallel perspective about that. Men are actually part of the development process, part of society, so we cannot just say that women should take charge of certain things. But it's more like, you know, people are usually resistant to anything that takes from their power and their assets. So I think that we need to involve men as well. We're not talking about giving some women some money and they will start some projects and then things will be better. Well, actually, most of
You're breaking a little bit.
That we're talking about.
Yeah.
So that's the first point. So I think that we need to have a more of a wider perspective about that. And also I think that we need to, as mentioned before a couple of times, that we need to have more work on climate change impacts, resilience, vulnerability for different groups, including women, and integrate the gender issue in the discussion. The last point is about resilience. Most of the time we talk about mitigation, we talk about adaptation, but actually it's more important to discuss the resilience, not just of communities as a whole, but for different groups. And that cannot be considered when everybody's talking about just development. So we need to have a sort of synergies between resilience to climate change and other sort of risks and development efforts. I think that could help in the perspective that we're talking about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mohammed, and absolutely the need for synergies. And what we mean by gender is not necessarily just looking at women. It's also about how to engage men in that conversation as well. And if you were to go for a deeper dive into it, then issues related to conceptualizations of masculinity, for example, and how that and femininity and how that plays within gender inclusivity and climate action. So there's a lot more. I mean, I completely agree with you. There's a lot more to kind of to be unearthed in that conversation. But of course, as Dr. Huda has mentioned, that some of the barriers that we encounter is also related to data scarcity and the absence of kind of more granular, in-depth research that kind of looks at those dynamics very closely and looks at, you know, to what extent also is participation in climate action and all of these initiatives that we've been hearing about at the COP. How are those going to affect gender dynamics and going to affect women's engagement with in society and within their households, and that's something I'm particularly interested in, because I think that there was that idea that the green economy could be a way forward for increasing women's integration in the labour force. And I know that Egypt has put a target of a 5% increase, and whether or not that 5% is going to come through the green economy or is going to come through, you know, the existing economy as it stands, I think is a question that is yet to be answered. But again, I'm keen to just get maybe one more reaction from the room, and then just go back to the speakers, and because there's a question that's been asked about what are on the ground actions that need to be in place in order to enhance and improve resilience of women to climate change, and that's a question that you asked as well, Mohammed, so I'm keen to ask our speakers and get their thoughts on that, but over to you first.
So just I have a few comments on the discussion that was going on right now, especially like coming from your question, which is why do we need women inclusion in this sort of process? So basically women inclusion would be very important because women doesn't have always like the right access to jobs in general. We have several issues that are pertaining to gender mainstreaming, which is the pay gap, the equal access to job, the childcare economy, and of course the sexual harassment and violence against women in workplaces. And with these issues, there come other like certain things that we need to do in order to have more proper transition, which is like this new term, which is the just transition. And the just transition does not only include the transition from like to green jobs, but also to include the social aspect, which is one of them, the gender, but it's not the only one, as actually like most of you have been talking about and saying it. And the fact that we really need this, especially in Egypt, because we don't always have the strongest sort of legislation support in order to empower women to work, and we have been actually working on it with the ministry for a very long time. For instance, only last year with Decree 43 and Decree 44 from the ministry, women are now legalized to work in hard working jobs and also working at night, which like in return would actually like contribute to the fact that women have access to fair and decent jobs with actual contracts that can support their own rights and also access to their own rights, which would also like be related to the fact that if we are now moving to green jobs and more like women would need actually more capacities and like bigger capabilities in order to compete with men for these actually jobs. Another thing which is also very important is the fact that as this is like some sort of a new topic for everyone. So as actually like the professor here said before, building an empirical evidence to support the enabling environment for women would be very, very important, because there are a lot of terminologies that are actually like vague for everyone. There are a lot of like gaps in sort of the narrative for women inclusion that is also vague for everyone. So contributing to this on like the different levels of workers, of private sector, of government, and also development institutions would be very important. Building such sort of a layer is like a safety net for everything that comes next, because it's like basically it would serve as like baseline zero for everyone, and then we can see how far we went over the years. Other than that, we'll be like more of shooting to the stars, and that never gets anyone anywhere. Last but never the least, also as we are talking about vulnerability, then it would be very, very important to talk about migrant women who are presented in different countries that have been migrating due to actually climate change sort of reasons. And like when they actually go from one place to another, they always lack the right sort of skills and capacities. And then if we ask them to add a different layer of competing into green jobs, it's also another obstacle for them to be included. And this impact women in a different way, because if they are vulnerable, they are actually sort of exposed to trafficking and to so many different other issues that are related to migration. My last point, and I will close it very quickly. It's just basically that when we are talking about women inclusion, it's not because we need women to take more of the pie of like what is currently available of jobs, but it's rather to have, as also like most of you have mentioned, is equal access to opportunities. This is like the main thing, while ensuring protection. And perhaps we can use the fact that the government now is supporting this transition by discussing possible solutions such as cutting taxes and everything. So perhaps while we are cutting taxes or reducing any sort of economic pressure on the private sector, then in return we need to ensure that women have better legislations and better access to jobs, especially with childcare. That the fact that the current law says that the companies are only obligated to offer childcare if we have 100 women registered in the company, not 100 parents, which impacts it a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you, that's great. And I think you've mentioned a lot of points that Dina and Jean had already referred to in terms of, you know, the varying vulnerabilities of women, migrant women in particular, and women who are internally displaced. And Dina also referred to kind of the broader socioeconomic factors that need to be taken into account. And there was mention of a need for a holistic approach. But I want to go back to Radwa and Paul, who've had their hands up for a while. And we've got only 10 minutes, unfortunately, and then I will have to wrap up. So just quick, succinct questions or reactions, and then Ali, and then we'll have to wrap up. Radwa, over to you.
Yeah, thank you for this session. I'm Radwa Abushadi, and I am basically from Alexandria. So this is relevant to my question about how we can formulate the policies to mitigate the impact on the governorates, for example, which is deeply or to a great extent will be highly affected by climate change compared to other governorates or other areas. It doesn't only apply on Egypt, but also on Tunisia, for example, and on Morocco or on other countries. The situation or the impact of climate change on women or on governorates is different. Although there is always a talk about how to localize and work with the NGOs and try to tailor the policies based on the needs of women, because also we know that women are not one size. There are women in rural areas, urban areas, poor women and rich women. So access to resources and their situations themselves is different. So how we can try to make policies that is really towards the need of women on the governorates, how to make the policy into the micro level, not only to have some policies on the macro level. This is my first question. And my second question is how we can also make sure that there is a sustainability of our efforts and our initiatives after the COP, because we know COP is only a phase, and the situation of the climate change is mainly on the long run. We know now that unfortunately, due to the fund and the what we can say the media interest and political will in climate change, the effort and the research is directed towards climate change. However, the threat is in the future. How we can make sure that this threat is there is sustainability of the projects to mitigate the impact. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Points well noted. Paul, over to you, please. Please, very succinctly. You're muted. Sorry. Can you
hear me now?
Now we can hear you. Yes, please.
Yeah. First of all, I don't have any question. I have a gift to offer to all of you. It's a gift from India. What Dr. Ali sir has explained, we have tried and give the capacity to our women to have data. Now, first question you started sharing how to have a logical, effective, dependable grassroots decision-making tool-based data. That is the first gift we have given to our unschooled women farmers. Through that, they did the miracle. They not only changed their vulnerability into a position of strength, position of negotiation, position of gender dignity, position of gender negotiation skill with the male orchestrated society, number one. So, our gift from India, our organization is Naidita Services, our innovation is Bhungru, BHUNGR, you can Google it. Our gift, our offer to all of you, if you like to try the way how data-based decision-making tool through unschooled women can be created through a conceived process of participatory knowledge sharing, and then use that data tool not only for adaptation, but also for mitigation and creating all 5 SDGs. We are there to help all of you. It is free of cost.
Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you. And you know, that's great, because I think collaboration, not just within the region, but across, you know, Africa and with other countries from all over the world is really important. And we didn't, unfortunately, get a chance to dig a little bit more deeply around the issues of complementarity and collaboration between northern and southern partners. But hopefully, and I think Dr. Ali would agree with me that this is the first of many other discussions that we would want to have around this issue. And NatSen International, we are building a research agenda around that. So we are very keen to take this forward. Now, before I close, I want to give each of the panelists just a quick 2-minute or 1 minute reaction. If there's anything, any comments, any reactions to the questions that have been posed and the reactions, just very quickly. Amira, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Shireen. Just a quick comment, reflecting on what Dr. Huda was saying, that people don't really understand what's the added value of them recycling. I agree, maybe the impact is not too big, but I think it's an individual responsibility. People have to start. We cannot wait for governments to take action. Aslan, there is political mobilization and political will that is increasing, especially with the events like COP27 and others happening around the world. So, but individuals also have to take action. I want to also emphasize on the important role of private sector and IFIs. International financial institutions, like the African Development Bank, the Asian. I've just seen an announcement from the Asian Development Bank that they will stop funding any carbon-based projects, and they will only fund the green projects. So the role is important. Private sectors are the private sector is starting to see the added value that there is no negative trade-off if they use clean energy. They can still make money, they can have financial returns, and be more sustainable. Thank you. Over.
Thank you so much. Dina, over to you.
I'm fine. I'll give my minute.
Layla, do you want to say anything? No?
I think I'm fine. Maybe just one thing that I missed when I was talking is about financing the startups, because it's very important that we make sure already women have a lot of challenge in accessing credit, especially when it comes to startups. Yeah. So especially with green economy, I think it will take also the profile of being a male-dominated area. So I think we have to be very careful, like donors like the EBRD and so on, as they design their programs. I think they need to take that into consideration.
Excellent. Dr. Huda, do you have any final reflections? Yes.
Maybe one word. I think in the climate domain, we have an opportunity because we're starting on the right foot in terms of scale. This is different from other, the health field, you always talk about public health sectors, hospitals. You don't have this constraint. So this is excellence. We can capitalize on it. And it's not just socioeconomic development when you talk about the public. It's really a value of justice, a value of accountability, which is in all domains. Okay. So I'll stop here.
Excellent. And Dr. Ali, yes, over to you.
Okay, it's just a comment. When you talk about equity, which is really the problem we're targeting, this is structural. If you look at most of our solutions, it tends to target the symptoms. And I'm going to use the analogy of climate. You talk more about adaptation. You're not talking about mitigation. Because if you're going to go into mitigation, that's going to require a restructuring of the ecosystem. There is a problem with the culture, there is a problem with the mindset, and having quotas, policies, procedures, equal opportunity. It has been tried in the US, for example, and it did not work. But this is just a comment. I understand it's harder, but we really have to put a target eventually. How do we demolish this inequality? And it's across, it's not just gender, it's across. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And just to say, I mean, my key takeaways from this discussion that I'm hoping to take forward when I go back with my team and hopefully with the Gerhardt Center also and others at the American University in Cairo, I think the first takeaway is the importance of centering power to the discussion. That, you know, power dynamics between men and women, power dynamics between national governments and at the subnational level, power dynamics between multilaterals and local actors, between financing institutions and grantees or people who are trying to access finance. Power is really very much at the heart of this conversation. If there is any way forward, there is a need to kind of center power to that discussion and make sure that there's an understanding of how power plays across both the climate adaptation, mitigation, and as well as the targets that we're setting. The second is that there is still a problem, and it is a problem that I don't think has been resolved both at the COP. We cannot resolve it today in this discussion, but that needs to be grappled with, is how do you link the macro and the micro level together? And that's a problem that, you know, we've grappled with in the international development and the humanitarian field with years. The whole localization debate is based on it. They need to kind of go deeper locally. But how do you kind of strengthen that while at the very same moment ensuring that at the macro level you've got the right policies, you've got the right political will, you've got the right checks and balances and the right levels of access to finance? So that's the second takeaway. And also related to that, the issues related to governance. And I think this is the elephant in the room, especially for the MENA region, which has very low governance rankings. You know, how do you square that circle? How do you sort that problem out? And then the last one is that there is a recognition, both at the COP and over here, that there's a need for a transitional phase, right? And how you embark on that transitional phase, the kind of resources and incentives that you need to have in place, and where gender fits within that transitional phase is for us to kind of carve out, essentially. And that needs mobilizing key stakeholders. Us as academics, so civil society organizations are key, but also government actors in the private sector. They all need to get on board on driving this forward from both that more kind of that visionary perspective that Jean was talking about, and I know that she had to step out, but also what Dr. Huda was talking about at the granular level in more specific ways, in specific sectors, specific problems that would then create that acupuncture effect. So I'll leave you with those problems and issues that we need to grapple with, I think, collectively, and just strongly urge that we continue that conversation beyond what we've discussed today. And I want to thank everybody who's joined us both online and in the room for your engagement, the richness of the discussions and the ideas, and also your personal commitment to the issues, which comes very clearly in your comments and your statements. And I would also like to very much thank the Gerhardt Center for hosting us and enabling this conversation to take place. I've always had a lot of respect for the Gerhardt Center for its leadership, and a big thank you to Dr. Ali, who also sits on the advisory board of NatSen International, for championing and kind of shepherding this process. And a big thank you also to the American University in Cairo. I'm very, very proud and very pleased to be here with all of you, and hope to continue that conversation with you soon. Thank you so much. And goodbye to everyone. Thank you. Thank you.